speak. It's an honor to be here. I came up this morning from Washington, D.C. by train, and I love coming to this area, so it's a real honor to join you this afternoon. I want to talk to you today about fear, freedom, and our collective future as Americans. Now, I'm going to start off by maybe sounding a little vulnerable by saying that I think sometimes people will think when I talk about wanting to discuss freedom, some of you might be thinking, you know, I don't look all that free myself. Sometimes people will immediately notice the way I'm dressed, and freedom isn't maybe the first word that comes to their mind. So I want to put that out there and talk about it briefly, because I think it's important for us to be really honest and have a real conversation about our American landscape. You know, oftentimes Muslims and Muslim women specifically, especially ones dressed like me, in the media are associated with words like victim, oppressed, and maybe even brainwashed. But the truth is, there are some advantages to dressing like this. First of all, I never have to have a bad hair day. It's very rare that I end up at a party and someone is dressed exactly like me, so that's always an advantage. It's also a great hands-free cell phone holder, which you know, I've always used, and it's a great conversation starter. I want to tell you a little bit about my background before I delve into this, because I think it's important context to what I'm about to say. I just had this very generous introduction. The truth is, I'm a Midwestern girl, grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. I was born in the Middle East and grew up in the Midwest. And I grew up in a very progressive college town, maybe a lot like Villanova. Madison, Wisconsin is otherwise known as the People's Republic of Madison, and 25,000 square feet surrounded by reality. But it was this progressive social environment that I really found my footing. That's where I became politically conscious. That's where I formed my views on the world. And it was within this context, it was within a context where conformity was looked down upon and individual thinking was valued, that I decided to adopt this way of dress. It was my choice and my decision to choose conscience over conformity. It was a spiritual choice, and in many ways it was a choice that was born out of not only my Muslim identity, but my American identity. An identity that means everyone has a choice, and individuality is something that we hold sacred. So that is the background. I want to talk to you about the facts and why the facts are so important in our future, in our collective progress as a nation. Because right now, the facts about America's engagement with Muslims around the world, the facts about Islam and its role in politics, its role in violence, are really obscured. And it's dangerous, not just for Muslims when these facts aren't clear, but for all of us as Americans. I want to talk to you about what Gallup discovered when we did research around the world asking ordinary people like you and me questions about their life, about their views, about what they wanted from their future, and why it matters to us today. So let me start with the Gallup Research that I wrote my book a few years ago about. This research was done among 90% of the global Muslim population. Surveys were conducted in more than 40 predominantly Muslim countries, and these surveys were done in a nationally representative way, where the samples contained young and old, men and women, rich and poor, educated as well as illiterate. Everybody had a chance to be selected, and so it was a representative sample. And when we conducted these polls, we asked people a lot of questions, including their views on violence, their views on specifically what we would define as terrorism, which is deliberately targeting civilians and killing them for a ideological purpose. What we found was this, and this is published on Gallup's website, it's also in the book if you'd like to check it out, was that when you ask these questions globally, not just among Muslim populations, but among all populations, people of any faith and no faith, what you find is that being a Muslim does not make you any more likely, statistically, to condone violence. In fact, often the opposite is the case. Muslims, especially, maybe surprisingly to you, some of you, in the Middle East, were the least likely to condone attacks deliberately attacking civilians. Now, why that's important is this. When we look at those few, the margin of that population who was condoning violence, and we look at that across the world, we can actually develop policies that will make us safer rather than fuel the fire of extremism by looking at facts rather than what we might assume or intuition or anecdote. When you look at those facts, and again I encourage you to look up these reports, what you find is that what correlates with a sympathy for violence among the general public is not religiosity. It's not being pious. It's not taking any specific book literally. It's not how frequently you attend a religious service. These things actually are pretty much irrelevant. What does correlate with a sympathy for violence is things like governance and your country's Human Development Index. So the levers of power, the levers of change that will actually make the world safer are not the things that we're using and not the things that we're talking about. You know, interestingly, Islam is a 1400-year religion, but the modern face of this terrorism we're seeing, like ISIS and before Al-Qaeda, who now seems tame compared to the grotesque brutality of ISIS, is actually quite new. It's a modern phenomena, yet it's an ancient religion. A religion that, for 1,000 years, actually created science, art, and technology. So if it is about Islam, why is this phenomena so modern? The answer is that we're actually looking at the cause and effect in the opposite order, and I'll explain what I mean. When we asked people all over the world how they felt about, say, an attack like 9/11, the vast majority condemned it. But then we asked a follow-up question of both those who condemned and those who condoned the attack. What we found was something surprising. Those who condemned the attack, when we asked them, why do you say that? They cited either humanistic, moral, or religious justifications for why they thought killing people, for innocent people, was wrong. They said things like, killing, these people were innocent. They should not have been killed, no matter what the government of their country does. Others actually cited direct verses from the Quran that prohibit killing innocent people. One respondent actually specifically cited the verse that says, killing one person is as if you've killed all of humanity. However, the fringe minority, the people who condone violence that were in the minority, when they explained their views, not a single one of them used religious justifications, to our surprise. What they said instead were very secular, political justifications. They talked about their views of geopolitics. They talked about American imperialism. Their responses were rooted in modern concepts of nation state and reciprocity, not ancient Islamic principles. When you look back at, say, an incident that was depicted in the film Munich, if you haven't seen it, it's a very interesting film. I encourage you to look at it. It was looking at a major terrorist attack against the Israeli team, Olympic team in Munich. What you find in that film, and I really thought this was very noteworthy, is that the terrorists who carried out that attack in the film, and it was a very historically accurate depiction, their rhetoric was incredibly secular. They were socialists. They were Arab nationalists. In fact, it was a group of Palestinians that were both Christian and Muslim. At that time, the dominant social narrative of the region was a socialist, secular, Arab nationalist narrative. And so when there were violent groups, that was the narrative that they used to mobilize and to justify their actions. Today, that landscape, that social landscape, has completely changed. Today in the Middle East and across Muslim-majority countries, Islam, the faith, has taken up a much more central part of people's social discourse. We find in our research that more than 90% of people in majority Muslim countries, actually Muslim and other faiths, say that religion is an important part of their daily life. So why are these groups using religious symbolism and religious rhetoric? Because it is the dominant social narrative. It is the dominant social discourse, just as Arab nationalism was 40 years ago. It is not surprising that this would be their language, their discourse, their social currency. They will adopt whatever social currency exists in the society. What often gets missed is that every movement in the Middle East speaks the language of religion. We ignore the movements that are pushing for greater literacy by talking about the fact that the first word revealed to the Prophet, according to Muslim belief, was read. But yet that is the narrative, that is the rhetoric used by pro-literacy movements in the Middle East. We ignore the fact that women's health movements focus on the fact that one of the great companions of the Prophet was a woman healer. This is not just these fringe violent groups that are using religion. In fact, everyone uses religion. I was very close, now it seems like a million years ago, but during the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, many people were sort of noticing that it was very interfaith, and it was very it didn't seem like there was one sector or one group that was dominating, which of course was true. But when you look closer, religion was a part of that mobilization, not in the way of a specific Islamist group, but people were speaking the language of hope in a religious way, just as we had that same rhetoric in our own freedom movement during the civil rights struggle. Using religion is what we would expect of any mass movement or a movement that wants to be a mass movement, which is actually my next point. When you look at the facts, groups like ISIS have dismal popular support. They are groups that have exceeded the realm of violence and brutality into sort of the pornographic spectacle. They are more a media organization than a military organization. And they have succeeded in disgusting the vast majority of Muslims around the world. Now, if we give them the legitimacy that they themselves are seeking by assigning them representation of an entire community that completely rejects them, we are actually handing them the rhetorical victory that they so desperately desire. Calling them people who are following Islam ignores, first of all, 1,400 years of tradition and history and scholarship and jurisprudence, major legitimate religious authorities that have condemned them and said that their actions have nothing to do with Islam and in fact diametrically oppose Islam. And I think most importantly, just the sheer number around the fact that the majority of those they murder are Muslims. This is often lost upon people, that groups like ISIS, before them Al-Qaeda, 90% of their victims were other Muslims. These are not groups that are mostly hurting people of other faiths as Muslims sort of stand by idly, not caring or not condemning them loud enough. These are people that are first and foremost a threat to Muslims around the world. First, because Muslims are their primary victims, but second, because Muslim young people are the people that they are exploiting, that they are trying to seduce into their web of delusion through internet-based radicalization. So to assume or to even question the idea of whether or not Muslims condemn them is to simply ignore these facts. The other piece that's important to understand is not only obviously not all Muslims are terrorists, but not all terrorists are Muslims. And this is really, I think, probably where the biggest misconception is. According to the UN, only 2% of terrorist attacks in Europe were actually carried out by Muslim groups. Yet we don't hear about the other 98%. This is not an issue of facts. It's an issue of where our media chooses to focus. There's a very interesting yearly report that comes out by a group called Media Tenor. They are a Germany-based media content analysis firm, and they do media content analysis mostly for corporations to tell them what the media is saying about their company. What they actually can predict investor behavior by looking at what the media says. It's really kind of scary how directly we are influenced by our media content. But what they found is that the majority of protagonists representing other faiths, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, in Western media are religious leaders, which makes perfect sense. It's a religion, so that should be who represents them in the media. But when it comes to Islam, the vast majority of those representing faith in media are militants. And so when we are consuming this media day in and day out, we can hardly be blamed for forming ideas about Islam being more prone to violence than other faiths. Now, what is the cost of this fear? And I think that that's really the important question here. Am I speaking about this sort of hysteria around fear of terrorism coming from in the name of Islam, is it only because it hurts Muslims? It creates an environment where hate crimes are frequent. Is it because of discrimination against Muslims? All of those things, of course, concern me personally as a Muslim American, and I have no apologies about being worried about that for myself, for my children, for my community. But that's not the only issue here. This is not just an issue of a small minority being impacted by Islamophobia in America. This is a much broader issue. And it's around the fact that anti-Muslim bigotry is a symptom of a much wider problem. And I'll give you two reasons why. The first is legislative. The first is in terms of laws. The organization I now work for, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, where I direct research, we just came out with a report where we looked at an empirical survey of every anti-Sharia and anti-foreign law legislation that has been proposed in all 50 states. And to my amazement, every single state in the Union has had a law like that proposed at the state level. Most of them have not passed, but every single state has had legislators propose these laws. And in all of these situations, 80%, so if you look at all the legislators that have proposed these laws, in 80% of the cases, that same legislator has also proposed a law that would curtail the rights of another group, be it voter suppression laws that would impact African Americans and Latinos, be it laws that curtail the power of people to collectively bargain in terms of unions, or reproductive rights, and the list goes on, anti-immigration laws. So these issues are not just impacting Muslims. It is really about Islamophobia being a threat to all, to being not just the rights of one group, but that same momentum is being used against many other people as well. It's really like Muslims, while they might be at the forefront of this issue, are more like canaries in the coal mine, and they are indicators of a toxic political climate that should alarm all of us. Now, the second reason we should be concerned, and I think it's the strongest reason, is because neuroscience has actually shown, this is very intuitive, but now we actually have hard science to back it up, that when people are afraid, they have three things happen to them, basically. Fear creates these three things: a greater acceptance of authoritarianism, a greater acceptance of conformity, and a greater propensity toward prejudice. Now, I don't know about you, but those sound like the exact three things that undermine any democracy. If you want people in a democracy to relinquish their rights, to relinquish the foundation of their democratic system, which is critical thinking, all you have to do is inject them day in and day out with fear. This fear isn't just impacting a tiny minority that you may not know anyone or not really care. It's impacting the entire country. Neurologically, fear makes us relinquish the very things we need to have a vibrant democracy. So this fear industry, and it is an industry, a $57 million industry to be exact, impacts all of us, and it is a danger to our democracy. So, in closing my brief remarks, and I look forward to your comments, I encourage us to move forward by accepting and by seeking facts and not fear. Thank you. So the floor is open. Yes?
Thank you so much again for coming and sharing.
Carl, we can't hear you.
Thank you so much again for coming and sharing your thoughts with us. My question has to do with the media. You touched on it a lot as sort of this engine of fear generation. Do you have any proposed systemic ways to handle that? I guess first is don't watch sometimes. But I guess like another aspect that I'm interested in is the increased agency in which we live in today. We have, access to technology and information at our fingertips. Maybe if you have any wise pieces of advice on how to consume information, how to consume news in a way that doesn't engender fear in us.
It's an excellent question, and really, yes, the question is about the media generating fear, and what do we do about it, basically? How do we address this problem, and how do we consume media in a way that would help us not relinquish our free thinking and our critical thinking and not have it generate fear in us? It is such a hard question to answer, but incredibly important. And I'm just going to tell you a very short story to really illustrate why it's such a good question. I had, before 9/11, I had gone like several years without watching TV news. I was just reading newspapers. And I decided to do that because I felt like it was just fluff and really poor, reporting. And then after 9/11, I started watching the news again because I needed to know what was going on, and it was just watching the news 24 hours a day. And because I had been away from it for so long, I had become sensitized that when I started watching it again, I noticed something that was happening to me. And what was happening, quite totally honestly, and it's a bit hard to admit, I felt this growing anti-Muslim sentiment that I myself was harboring, was building inside me. And I thought to myself, if this is happening to me, not only do I know a Muslim, but I know a Muslim really well, what about everyone else who doesn't have that context and doesn't have that personal experience? It is incredibly powerful mind control. And the first thing, the first thing to know is to be aware that it's happening. Don't ever think the news and the media is like neutral or balanced or fair and balanced, definitely. Be aware of the fact that there is something called agenda setting theory, that the news does make you think a certain way, to the point where there are firms out there that by simply doing media content analysis can tell companies how investors will behave. I mean, it's that exact of a science. So be aware of that there is this impact on you. But I also think that we need to do two other things. One is to hold the media accountable. We are the consumers of the media, right? Now, a lot of this, I believe this from having gone to business school. I've heard this said, and I think it's totally true. It said, if you're not paying for a product, then you're the product, okay? So if you're not paying for the product, then you're the product. Meaning, you are what is being offered as the end product. So in the case of TV media or any media, you are the product in that it's free, meaning there's advertisement, and you're what's kind of keeping that thing going. You're the one buying these products, and if you weren't consuming that media, those advertisers wouldn't continue to pay for that airtime. So if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. Keep that in mind. That means you have some rights. You have the ability to hold media outlets accountable for better coverage, for more balanced coverage. So that's one thing, is to object, is to criticize, is to speak out against a biased coverage. But first you have to recognize it, and the way to recognize it is to educate yourself about the facts. Now the second thing is, right, there's social media, and people, I think, sometimes exaggerate the power of social media, but I think I just witnessed how it really is quite powerful. So this last week, you know, hopefully most of you have heard, there was a horrible attack on 3 young people in North Carolina where Charles Hicks walked into someone's apartment, you know, their home, and literally executed them. And it was completely not being covered at all. I mean, it was amazing. It was like a media blackout, and it was only because of social media and people, you know, the hashtag. I think it was Chapel Hill shooting that kept going around, and it was because of social media that the mainstream media then had to catch up and start covering the issue. The same thing really happened with the Arab Spring. People talk about social media made that thing happen. It did and it didn't. It was that social media forced mainstream media to cover it, and then it became a big thing. But the power of social media is there. And so don't underestimate the power of the people to force mainstream media to cover the things that you think are important, and to cover them in a way that makes sense. But also keep in mind the incredibly, what often for people who are in this field, really frustrating double standard. And I'm just going to take this one horrible incident as an example. Until now, it's not being officially called a hate crime, and it's certainly not being called a terrorist attack, of course. I mean, a white atheist shoots 3 Muslims. Like, how is that a terrorist attack? It can't be. It's impossible. But within hours of the Copenhagen shooting, I mean, the headline was terror attack, and then it said on the heels of the Charlie Hebdo attack. So they were connected immediately, even though they actually had nothing. The people had nothing to do with each other in different countries. They're, you know, separate. There's separate incidences. It's like if we were to connect the dots every time, you know, a white guy in America shoots someone, it would be like there's this epidemic, right? But there's only an epidemic in terms of gun violence. We don't attribute it to their race or to their culture. So we choose how to frame these things. We choose what we call these things, what we attribute the motive is before any investigation had been done. This was literally right when it happened. It was called a terror attack. And terrorism is something you have to prove. It's not something you sort of just decide is a terrorist attack. Just like we're being told, well, you don't know, it might be parking dispute or not, it might be a hate crime or not, we have to investigate, this will take, you know, weeks and months. But in the case of the Muslim, you know, this guy with a criminal background, had all these problems, had committed crime before in Copenhagen, but his identity is he's a Muslim, so of course it's a terrorist attack. He was motivated by his faith. So it's a very, you know, we have to be aware of these, what to me are blatant double standards, and step away from that and look at things objectively. Yes?
It's funny that you said double standards, because my question was regarding that people talk a lot about how church and state should be separate, and they attribute a lot of the issues with Islam, with the Islam violence, about it being so tight with the government and things like that, which you clearly have been talking about how it's not really as it's been painted. I mean, here in the U.S., every president talks about, I mean, the thing is, like, one nation under God, and every president talks about, like, human beings, like, under God. So, like, I don't know, I think that's also hypocritical. But, however, in France, for example, you have laws against Muslims wearing, I think it's the hijab,
yeah,
or the burqa, I can't remember which one was proposed. So it's these laws that are happening, and I think something similar was tried to pass here in some states, where they're putting these restrictions and they're trying to, like, block that the place of religion in everyday life. In that case, it impacts Muslims, but because, like, I guess a cross is easier to hide than a burqa.
Yeah.
But I don't know. What about that separation that apparently you can't bring religion into public life?
Well, I think the issue of you know, it's interesting you bring up this issue of religion and public life, because the way it's approached, so if we call that secularism or separation of church and state, the way it's approached in France and the way it's approached in the United States are really different. So in France, it is really a freedom from religion, a freedom from religion in the public space. So, for example, I was just in Paris in May this last year, and I met with French Muslims and others, and what they were explaining to me, I was really, I knew, you know, I knew about the ban on the hijab in public schools and in government offices and so forth, but they were telling me that you're not actually allowed to pray, and just even privately pray at work. So with Muslims who have to pray 5 times a day, they're actually curtailing their ability to practice their faith. I mean, you literally are, it's against the law to pray at work. So it's not a freedom of religion. It's a freedom from religion that, if you want to be a religious person, is a violation of your religious freedom from the perspective of an American you know, approach. In America, at least theoretically, it's about freedom of religion, where everyone is supposed to be allowed to practice their faith as they wish. And it's interesting, the issue with the ban on the hijab, there was one state that wanted to ban it in public schools, and I just want you actually to be aware of what law they were using to try to do that. And it was a law that was passed about 80 years ago, meant for Catholic nuns. It was not meant for Muslims. They were using that same law that was meant to exclude Catholics. They're called the Blaine Amendments. They don't apply anymore to Catholics, but they're being revived to now apply to Muslims. And the rhetoric used against Catholics at that time is identical to what is used against Muslims today. They were accused of owing their loyalty to a foreign prince, that they weren't really American because they you know, looked to the Vatican for guidance, and their loyalty was always questioned, and it's very similar to what is now being used against Muslims, even to the point where the same law was attempted to be used to ban school teachers from who wore hijab from the school system. Now that was overturned, and now they are allowed to wear hijab in the school system, and that was really an amazing. I mean, this is where I really give America some credit. Is that was hailed as a victory by the Justice Department, and so at least there is a, you know, a First Amendment guarantee of freedom of the practice of religion. That kind of freedom of practice is not so clear in a French context. Mm-hmm.
Thank you again for your incredible and eye-opening speech. You refer to Islam as a religion, a very ancient religion. But I think the way that it's been seen through the media, we see Islam more politically now than ever before. But my question is, do you think this is an after effect of 9/11, or is this how Islam has been throughout history as well?
It's a good question. Islam has, you know, always been a religion that inspired people to act in the real world, in the public space, including to build civilizations and to act politically. So I can't say that this concept is totally foreign to the reality of Islam, but to associate it with violence is where there is a misunderstanding. Because first, these terrorist organizations that exist are using the dominant social medium, which happens to be Islam at this time, and taking that desire for violence and projecting it onto the faith and interpreting the faith in that convenient way. It's not that the faith has, you know, the verses from the Quran have come up with their hand and forced themselves on these people and forced them to be violent. It's the other way around. The violent people are forcing their vision onto the text rather than the text forcing its vision on regular people and making them violent. Because if it was that way, then we would have seen these terrorist organizations throughout history, which we did not. So I think that's the real difference between facts and fiction. Is Islam and violence, that connection just simply does not exist. If anything, it's quite the other way around, where people are justifying their opposition to violence by using Quranic verses, basically. Yes?
There's a quick footnote to what you were saying about the industry of fear and also the question about the news. There was an article in the New Yorker a year or two ago about, I don't think it was only about Fox News, but part of it was about Fox News. And Fox News is an extreme, but I think what happened, if I can remember, the author spoke to the administrators of Fox News about the truth or mendacity of what they produce, and they openly admitted that they aren't even trying to be truthful. Truth, facts is not what it's about. They were about creating something marketable, and I suspect that Fox News is not the only place where this is true.
No.
So that's something to bear in mind when we're thinking about the news and the media and what they're telling us.
We are the product, yes. If you're not paying for it, you are the product. Yeah.
So in the beginning, you mentioned how if someone were to look at you, they would see you as not free and maybe even brainwashed. So I was wondering, what would you tell that person to educate them more as to how you dress and how you choose to dress?
Okay, that's a great question. I would say, I dress this way because I interpret my faith to tell me that this is pleasing to God, that this is something that I do as an act of devotion to God. And I can give you a really long conversation or a really long explanation of why that might be. Why does God ask this of me? And I'm happy to do that. But I want to just question one thing, which I think, is just, again, getting us to think critically. When you think about what does it mean to be oppressed, just think of the word oppressed. What does that mean? Most of the time, oppressed people are people who have had their power taken away from them. When you're not allowed to vote, that's a form of oppression because I've taken away your political voice. So oppression is about the taking away of power. Okay? Now I want you to think about something. When you see people like, Yasser Arafat, he's a famous political figure from the past, but I think you all maybe have seen pictures of him. He basically dresses, or used to when he was alive, he dressed kind of like me. I mean, he always wore a head covering and, was covered, essentially all his whole body was covered. Someone dressed like that, I've never heard anyone say that he was oppressed by the way he was dressed. Yet a woman dressed the exact same way is oppressed by her covering. Okay, so just think about that for a minute. Why is the source, what is that saying about the source of a woman's power versus a man's power? When we think of a powerful man, what does he look like in your mind? Is he wearing a Speedo? No, right? He's wearing a nice tailored suit. He's basically entirely covered, except for his hair maybe. Now, a powerful woman, really, be honest. What does she look like? The one that just walks in and everyone's paying attention and she can just order people around. She has a gorgeous body that's generously exposed. Let's just be honest. So there is a root problem with the idea that covering a woman's body, privatizing her sexuality, is oppressive. It's actually very misogynistic.
Going off of that, what is your perspective on the niqab as, in relation to the hijab? Because I know the hijab is almost always a spiritual choice that Muslims grow up in. But what do you say about the niqab being a spiritual choice as well?
Okay. Well, I think it's a great question. First, I do want to just add one more thing about the hijab before we leave that topic. And that is part of the surveys we did around the world was to ask women if they covered their hair or not, and then why or why not, both groups. And what we found was that the number one reason for women who did cover was they felt that it was a religious obligation. So they were doing it, and we had other choices around their father forced them, their brother forced them, whatever. That was hardly anyone. It was because they felt that this was something that God was asking of them. And women who didn't cover felt their number one reason was they felt that it wasn't a religious obligation and they didn't want to. So it was a difference in interpretation. That's out there, that's fine. But it's important to understand that those who are covering are doing it out of believing that that this is how they are, exercising their faith. So taking that right away is taking away religious freedom, and it's taking away really a woman's right to choose. It's an incredibly obvious point to me that it's the furthest thing from liberating women by prohibiting them from practicing their faith. I don't know in what universe does prohibiting someone from practicing their conscience, acting on their conscience, a form of liberation. And so this is where I'm always dumbfounded by the arguments of some, say, French feminists. Now, the piece about niqab. Niqab is, of course, the covering of the face. This is most women don't cover their face. Some women do, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. Some are cultural. Some are an interpretation of the faith that they believe that it's required. I personally, don't believe it's required. Obviously, I'm not covering in that way. But I think that there's undue attention on the niqab because it actually isn't. It's just not very. It's not very widespread. So when a country in Europe bans the niqab and makes every political discussion about the niqab, I'm wondering what's really behind that, because it's not like there's this epidemic of niqabis everywhere. And there's probably 3 in the whole country. So why the obsession with it? I mean, and then this issue of their identity, and we don't know who they are and whatever. Well, I have the wonderful privilege of always getting secondary checks in the airport. Okay, so I'm always, right when they see me, what they will say, I mean, I know this because I travel so much, is female assist. Female assist means, for anyone who's had that experience, that a female needs to come to do the secondary check on me. So we do have this concept of women coming and checking other women when they're traveling. So the idea that someone who chooses to cover their face can have a female check their their face identification against their ID is not unheard of. I don't think it's the biggest problem in the world. So as an American here, and I'm emphasizing this, I don't wear niqab. I wouldn't encourage anyone to wear niqab. But I really feel that as an American, I would defend someone's right to choose that. Just like I defend, Amish people, their right to not have a photograph ID. They're not even allowed to take pictures of themselves, yet they seem to sort of survive life and no one worries about it. So I think I'm almost questioning more why it has become such a political issue in places like Quebec, places like France, and places like Belgium, in places in Northern Europe, where it's this big political argument and debate, and the niqab. It's like, really, has your country been overrun by people covering their face that you have to make it such a huge deal? There's something else behind it. It's like the minaret ban. How are minarets hurting you in any way? It's a deeper issue of identity politics and a deep xenophobia that is really hurting these countries and is a symptom of a wider problem.
So Dalia, other questions? Oh, sure, go ahead, Dr.
1 century ago, one prominent Islamic thinker, Jamaluddin al-Afghani, went to Western countries And after living there, he said that I see there Islam, but don't see Muslims.
Right.
And after returning back to his native country, he said, I see here Muslims, but I don't see Islam.
Right.
So can you comment on this?
Yeah, sure. Okay, sure. So this is a very famous quote that I think it was nodding, and in fact, it's so interesting you bring it up because I grew up hearing this from our imams and Muslim leaders who would say this all the time. But it's a famous quote where Afghani, he's a famous reformer who spent time in Europe, and his famous quote was, when he experienced sort of Western culture at that time, was in the early 20th century, was, I went to the West and I saw Islam and no Muslims, and I went to the East and I saw Muslims and no Islam. Meaning that in the West, Islam was being practiced without it being Muslims doing it, but that the issues of fair dealing and good governance, etc., representative government, democracy, just people treating each other fairly, was happening, even though, so this is what he meant by Islam. The principles of Islam were being practiced, whereas in his own countries or in his own part of the world, these principles were lacking, even though there were Muslims. And I think the comment, I think it's an interesting comment, or it's an interesting quote, in that we heard really much of the same kind of idea in the polls that we did across the world, where this idea that they hate us for our freedom is totally wrong. It's empirically incorrect. When we asked Muslims around the world what they admired most about the West, they talked about technology, and they also talked about freedom and democracy. They explained that people had a say, that laws applied to everyone equally, that governments were transparent. So these are the things that people believe are their own values or own principles that are being practiced more effectively, perhaps, in the West than in their own countries. But they are, just because you don't see in some places flourishing democracy, it's not because it's not what people want. It's not because it's not people's desire, aspiration. And at least for a brief moment during the Arab Spring, I felt like it proves that this was something that was shared. These aspirations are human aspirations. They're not a Western phenomena, and I think that statement, that quote that you just cited, as well as the events of the past few years, really disprove and dismantle the idea of the clash of civilizations. The whole thesis around the clash is that there are these two diametrically opposed sets of values, that there's democracy and the value of democracy, and then there's the Muslim world that doesn't value democracy, that values faith over democracy, and somehow these two things are contradictory. And that because of these two opposing value systems, there's this inevitable clash. What we found is that that's not the case at all. First, poll after poll shows that people, while not enjoying democracy, certainly aspire to it, admire it, and in many of these cases sacrificed immensely for the prospect of getting it. So the very premise, the very assumptions that this whole clash of civilization is built on are empirically false using polling. And when we said that, when we published before the Arab Spring, that was considered controversial. But it's being demonstrated historically false by the extent to which people were willing to sacrifice and risk, real risk to their lives, just to ask for these values that we are taking for granted here in our country.
So Dalia, I want to play devil's advocate. If I'm not convinced by what you presented, which is compelling evidence, I mean, my counter would be looking at the globe. If you look at extremists, and not necessarily violence, but just extremists, people who take their ideology to an extreme in terms of who they think are believers and who they think are infidels, and therefore, who they can target for sexual abuse, rape, so on. It doesn't have to be death. why are they all Muslim, right? So, you know, sort of, can you give us a little bit more about empirical data about why that counters this notion that Muslims have the monopoly on extremism? And the second question is, could you say a little bit more about your experience in Washington, and particularly how your results have been received or not in the various circles that you've had access to?
Okay, sure. Well, one thing, your first question on why are Muslims prone to extremism more than others, I'm going to start by saying, first they're not, and I'll explain why. But the first thing we have to understand before I can sort of explain why that is to universalize the concept of ideology, okay? Islam is an ideology, just like nationalism is an ideology. Now, different countries have, different parts of the world, different regions, different cultures have different dominant ideologies that sort of govern or are the dominant discourse of that nation. So when you think about dominant discourse, in the United States, I would say our dominant discourse, now we're all it's always invisible to us because it's the water that all the fish are swimming in and they're like, what's water, right? But we do have a dominant discourse in the United States, and for especially Europeans, they are like, you guys are so nationalistic, it's insane how you deal with the flag and the way you talk about your military, it's scary, you know. So to even Europeans, we're so ultra nationalistic. But to us, it's like, well, this is just normal, this is just how you are, you know. So we have a very dominant discourse around nationalism. In majority Muslim countries today, it wasn't like that 40 years ago, their dominant discourse and their dominant social currency is religion. In Europe, it's something else. So what has happened is in all of these contexts, there are a minority of people that take the dominant discourse and go to an extreme. It is not just Muslims, but it's everybody. Have you ever heard anyone talking about, I mean, in our context here in the United States, where you're basically accused of being un-American? When you're accused of being un-American or saying something that's un-American, it is the equivalent of being a heretic in a religious society. You are targeted, and that we have had situations where we've had, you know, the House, you know, Committee on American Activity. Being un-American is a huge sin, and it's because our dominant ideology, our dominant social discourse is nationalism. The idea of heresy and the idea of this extremism of saying if you're not in this group, then you're outside of who we are, exists in all societies. It just takes on different forms depending on the dominant social currency. So in Europe, there's the rise of the, you know, the ultra-right in places like Britain, in places like Germany, in places like Belgium, in places like France, where they've taken that dominant discourse and they've taken it to an extreme. And every year, to my dismay, these groups are growing more and more. And the kinds of things they say, the kinds of policies they call for, even a conservative in America would be aghast by, but yet it's growing. So this idea that this extremism and ideology is only in the Muslim world is only because we're not seeing things for what they are, which is that dominant discourse occurs everywhere. And extremism in that dominant discourse occurs everywhere. It just happens to take on a religious flavor in some parts of the world, whereas in other parts of the world, it takes on a more secular but still idealistically extreme flavor. And talk about violence, I mean, for some strange reason, people ignore how secular ideologies have created enormous violence that would put religion to shame, would dwarf the violence that is, you know, in the name of religion. I mean, World War I and II, that is violence in the name of a, you know, nationalistic ideology. So we have to universalize these concepts to be able to really do an apples-to-apples comparison.
Yeah, I would argue that besides nationalism, a great social ideology that the United States has is individualism.
Mm-hmm.
That everyone makes their own choices, and I think you alluded to that earlier. Everyone makes their own choices, and that, for example, like what your parents do have nothing to do with you and whatever. So I think it is ironic that an entire group is being condemned, as if, for example, people that say that Muslims have a responsibility to go against, to proclaim themselves against ISIS, or that they as a group represent something that they're not capable of making their own choices. I see a great irony there. Could it be that they just are not taken to fit into that individualistic ideology, and that like the idea of Islam is seen as automatically foreign, like separate from this culture?
I think there is an otherizing of Islam, and the idea that there is actually a misperception that Islam is foreign, which is at the heart of some of this. First, as President Obama has stated, and in fact is historically true, Islam has been in the United States since its inception. Islam is as American as is Christianity and Judaism. It's not new to America. There were Muslim explorers. There were, of course, enslaved Africans who were Muslim. They were very early American of the Islamic faith. So Islam is not foreign. It helped build this country just like any other religion that is recognized. But the other thing about this issue of individualism, it comes in at certain points, but then at certain points we become very conformist. We do, as Americans, aspire and value individualism, but then in some cases, our sense of individualism, it really gets subsided to rallying around the flag. And this is what some people will notice. I mean, something that you may not know is that Americans have the highest confidence in their military of any country in the entire world. 90% confidence in our military. You know what our confidence in our Congress is? 13%. So we've got an elected body that represents our democracy with 13% confidence, and our military has 90% confidence. Now, if you were an alien coming down and just saw those numbers, what kind of society would you think you were, sort of entering, right? So we as a society have, that's almost invisible to us, tendencies really toward a very nationalistic discourse and dominant narrative. If we become afraid, then we relinquish that individualism. And that's why fear really does impact everyone and is so dangerous. Now, something else that Americans, have, besides this incredible confidence in our military, is there was a question that was asked around the world. I think it's quite interesting. And it was the moral acceptability of sacrificing your life for a cause you believe in. Okay, that was the question. The two countries with the highest percentage of people saying it's absolutely morally acceptable to sacrifice your life for a cause you believe in. The two countries of the highest in that question, and to say that it's acceptable, were the United States of America and Saudi Arabia. So we have to take these sort of facts and understand that these concepts of military sacrifice are not foreign to the United States of America, but we're not conscious of them, and we can sometimes look at other phenomena and think that they're very peculiar, when really they're just a different flavor of the exact same phenomena. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us.